Szeth's son Vallano, truthless of Shinovar, wore white on the day he was to kill a king. And today we'll see if he can do the same to another Cosmere character we all know and love, Marsh from Mistborn Era 1. Hello and welcome to another episode of Cosmere Versus, where we put two Cosmere characters against each other to see who the better character is. Today we have Szeth from the Stormlight Archive up against Marsh from Mistborn. As you probably know by now, we'll be putting these characters against each other to compare their backstory, growth, personality, relationships, and combat abilities. And remember, this is all my subjective opinion, so if you disagree with me, then I highly encourage you to let me know in the comments. Perhaps we can get a proper discussion going. Also, before I start, feel free to put down below who you think would win. Anyway, let's jump right in, starting with backstory. Szeth's backstory begins in his homeland of Shinovar. Having been raised in a good family, Szeth had a peaceful life, far from the conflicts of the world. His family was charged with guarding and training with the honor blades, which seems to be a fairly respected position in Shin society. Then his life changed when he made a claim that the Shin shamans found heretical. Szeth claimed that the Voidbringers were going to return to Roshar. The shamans were greatly outraged by this and for his transgression named him truthless. He was stripped of rank, title and personhood. He effectively became a slave, with whoever held his oathstone being his master. He could not kill himself, nor could he discard the oathstone. Due to his ownership of Jezreel's honor blade and his trained skill in using the surges, he was utilized as an effective assassin. His most notorious assassination, of course, being the assassination of King Gavilar of Alethkar. Since that day he was known as the Assassin in White. Marsh's backstory is far simpler. He was born of a Scar mother and noble father. Being a half-breed, he was born with the elementic ability to burn bronze. Just like his younger brother Kelsier, he hated injustice and as a result became the leader of the Scar Rebellion. He and Kelsier argued often, but there was still love between the two brothers. Shortly before the events of the first Mistborn book, Marsh suffered a great personal loss. The woman he loved, who also happened to be Kelsier's wife, Mare, and Kelsier himself were both captured during an infiltration of the Lord Ruler's palace. They were sent to the pits of Hathsin, where Mare eventually died. The loss of those dear to him made Marsh quit as the leader of the rebellion. He tried to keep a low profile after that and would have succeeded in living out the rest of his life normally had Kelsier not returned. Together, the two brothers worked on overthrowing the final empire. Marsh's role in the plan was to infiltrate the Steel Ministry, which seemed to be going well until his life was changed forever when they turned him into a Steel Inquisitor. Comparing the two backstories is tough, since both are pretty intense. On one hand we have Szeth, who fell from grace and was forced into becoming a killing machine. On the other we have Marsh, who tried to save his people and ultimately got turned into a killing machine as well. Overall, I'd give the win to Marsh. His backstory seems a lot more tragic and developed than that of Szeth at the moment. It's a tough call for sure, but I stand with my decision. Growth. Szeth's growth throughout the story hasn't fully concluded yet, but we can already see a massive change from the man he was before. When we first met Szeth, he was acting against his will, doing the bidding of his master and hating himself for it and for his past. He was a broken man and seemed haunted by the deaths he had caused. Then we see him slowly but surely realize that he wasn't actually truthless. He was right about the Voidbringers all along and was banished from Shinovar for nothing. Understandably, he was furious, and after being brought back from the brink of death by Nail, he swore vengeance on his people. We then saw how Szeth underwent profound internal struggles as he came to grips with the man he was and the man he was becoming. Under the guidance of the Skybreakers, he learned to hone his skills as a Radiant. Then, under the guidance of Dalinar, he learned to devote himself to a higher cause than he was used to. We have yet to see how his journey will end, but I think it's clear that he's progressed quite well as a character. Marsh, on the other hand, definitely underwent a lot of change, but how much of it was internal? He became a Steel Inquisitor and was under the influence of Ruin for a long time. He didn't want to be controlled or hurt his friends, but he naturally had no choice. For a long time, we saw how he tried to resist and wanted to kill himself whenever possible, though he was never able to do it. Other than that, however, we don't really get to see if he had any personal growth as a character. Sure, there was some change, but other than his physical changes and the experiences he went through, he doesn't really show any great change internally. He's still the same Marsh personality-wise. I like Marsh, don't get me wrong, but it would be disingenuous of me to say he developed as much as a character. I won't beat around the bush or try to sugarcoat it. Marsh didn't develop nearly as much as Szeth did, and there's really not any debate about that fact. As such, I give the win for growth to Szeth. Szeth just had a lot more growth and seems to still be growing as a character, so the winner here is quite clear-cut. Personality. Szeth's personality is a bit tough to pinpoint. He goes from a very sullen, stoic character to someone with clearly a lot of anger and resentment. Not to mention, he's also a tad unhinged from his experiences and from being brought back to life. By the end of the latest book, Szeth has become a much stronger character for sure. Having devoted himself to Dalinar, he's clearly become a lot more stable than before, but still has issues that can't be overlooked. His seething hatred for those who wronged him is a major part of it. He obviously hates Taravangian for being made to kill so many people, but beyond that he also very clearly hates the stone shamans who condemned him as truthless. In fact, his whole drive and purpose is to purge the Shin people who exiled him for their transgressions. He's fueled by anger and hatred, wanting little more than revenge for his past. Marsh's personality, though, isn't as dynamic as that of Szeth. When we first meet him, he's the stoic man who disapproves of Kelsia's antics, but who still wants to improve the life of his people. He's often seen with a scowl and with hard eyes that stares into one's soul. During his change into a Steel Inquisitor, he becomes a lot more despondent and suicidal, but with obvious good reason. He hates what he's become, but can do nothing to stop it. However, he's clearly determined to try and overcome the situation he's in. He never really stops being the stoic, hard man we met in the Final Empire. His personality is very static in that aspect and doesn't really change much as a result. Compared to Szeth, he doesn't really hold up much in terms of personality. Overall, I'm giving the win to Szeth here. The Shin man's personality is a lot more defined and a lot more fluid. We see him at different points and we see how he reacts to a lot of issues he has to face. Point goes to Szeth. Relationships. This section will likely not go very well for Szeth, though not through any direct fault of his own. In terms of personal relationships, Szeth doesn't really have any. Sure, he has a few people he's devoted himself to throughout the series so far, but that doesn't really constitute a proper relationship. When he considered himself truthless, he was devoted to whoever held the Oath Stone, though he never really had real interpersonal relationship with any of his masters. Then, when he joined the Skybreakers, he devoted himself to Nail and the swearing of his ideals, though that still wasn't a two-sided relationship either. And finally, when he pledged himself to Dalinar, he once again was not entering a proper relationship between two people. In each of these instances, he was very much just a subservient slave in a large way. Even with Nightblood, I wouldn't really say he has much of a relationship. Sure, they talk every now and then, and sure, there's some interaction there beyond just master and slave, but it's still not much of a relationship. At best, it's a tenuous acquaintanceship that Nightblood would quickly forget should it change hands at some point. Marsh, on the other hand, has some pretty strong relationships in his life. For one, he had his brother, Kelsia. Marsh's relationship with Kelsia was rocky at the best of times, I won't deny that, but he still had love for his brother despite their differences. And during the events of the Final Empire, Marsh began to see Kelsia as slowly maturing into the man he hoped he would become one day. Marsh was also deeply in love with Mare, Kelsia's deceased wife. Now, while this certainly didn't help the already turbulent relationship with his brother, it further proves that Marsh was clearly a man with many connections to many people. He, like many Scar in the Final Empire, had little else but the relationships he could forge with other people. And that's not to mention the fact that Marsh was once the leader of the rebellion. While we have no real insight into that part of his past, it's clear that he had to have forged relationships with others to get to that point. Marsh is not as defined by his relationships as other cosmic characters are, but he definitely had his fair share of them in his lifetime. I think it comes as no surprise that I award this point to Marsh. Maybe after the 5th Stormlight book we'll see Szeth's past and the relationships he's had, but at this point Marsh is the character with more depth and real relationships between the two. Combat. Now, this is the part that most of you seem to look forward to. I think we'll all have a pretty good idea of who would win a fight between these two characters, but let's take stock and see what each combatant brings to the table. And as is customary with these videos, we'll take them as they are at the end of their latest books, with their most up-to-date set of abilities. On one hand we have Szeth. Szeth is a Skybreaker Radiant with access to the Surge of Gravitation, as well as the Surge of Division. Now, we haven't seen him use the second Surge yet, but he does still have access to it and thus will consider it as part of his abilities. In addition to that, while he has not summoned it yet, he has bonded a High Spren and thus has access to a Shard Blade. He's also trained with all the surges in his past and is extremely skilled in hand-to-hand as well as sword combat. Finally, he also has the ability to heal damage with Stormlight. Now, while he does wield Nightblood, I will not be counting that as part of his abilities. Nightblood is a one-of-a-kind weapon within the Cosmere and is incredibly overpowered. For that alone, I feel it would be unfair to include it in this analysis. Not only that, but it's also technically not an ability of his and is just a sword that he happens to be in possession of at the moment. Because of that, I'm not counting Nightblood. If you think about it, anyone with Nightblood could defeat even a Shard despite having no abilities or combat skill. Just look at the end of Rhythm of War. Now let's look at Marsh and his abilities. First and foremost, he is a Steel Inquisitor. This means that he essentially has all the abilities of a full Mistborn and a full Feruchemist. Now, I will admit that the power is likely slightly diluted to an extent considering the way Hemalurgy works. However, consider the fact that the Lord Ruler himself was a full Mistborn and Feruchemist. This should give you an indication of just how much power Marsh likely has at his disposal. If you've read Alloy of Law, you'll have a good idea of just how powerful gold compounding is. As a hint to those of you who are unfamiliar, Brandon has said the only way to kill a Knight Radiant would be decapitation or something similarly extreme. Gold compounders could probably still survive even that much abuse or more just because of how quick and powerful their healing is. And as someone with the abilities of a Feruchemist and Allomancer, Marsh likely has access to that and all other compounding abilities. So taking that into consideration, you could consider Marsh to be a slightly weaker, watered down version of the Lord Ruler himself. And then consider that Marsh has been alive for over 300 years as of the latest Mistborn book. This means that he's probably become even more skilled at using his abilities and being even more proficient at combat. Pitting the two against each other is tough. Szeth is a Knight Radiant of arguably one of the strongest orders considering their abilities. He can use his Shard Blade to instantly kill Marsh if he got close enough to cut his spine. However, Marsh can't be overlooked either. Marsh has feruchemically enhanced pushing and pulling abilities. This means he could very likely push or pull Szeth's blade to an extent. There is a debate on whether or not an Allomancer could pull on a Shard Blade. Since it's made of a god metal and is heavily invested, I am of the opinion that they could, but very minimally and with great effort. But with Marsh's abilities, I'm fairly confident that he could do enough to at least prevent the blade from getting near him. And considering the fact that a handful of coins could essentially be considered an overpowered shotgun in Marsh's hands, and I think it's fairly obvious who would win. In my opinion, the victory goes to Marsh in the realm of combat, though I have a sneaking suspicion a lot of you might disagree on this. If Szeth had Shard Plate, I think the fight could swing in his favor, but as of right now, he's still exposed to harm. I'm giving the point to Marsh, but I'd love to hear what you all think about it. Let me know in the comments. And with all of that said, we have our final score for this episode of Cosmere Versus. Marsh walks away the victor, with Szeth trailing behind. It was a fairly close matchup, and the combat round could have made it swing either way. Unfortunately, Szeth just doesn't match up to Marsh's abilities in this case. Marsh is officially crowned the winner. Anyway, that's been it from me for today, guys. What did you think about the video? Did Marsh win fair and square, or is Szeth the true victor here and I was just overlooking something? Let me know in the comments below. Also, remember to like and subscribe if you haven't yet. But thank you very much for watching. My name has been Raven, and I will see you all next time. Take care, everybody.